They laughed when the 45-year-old man stepped onto the bus, his worn leather jacket creaking in the cold. They mocked his silence. They mocked the German shepherd at his feet. To them, he looked like just another tired man from a forgotten town in Montana. An easy target. But they didn't see his eyes. They didn't notice how the dog never blinked. And they definitely didn't know what that quiet man had survived before he ever sat on that bus. When one of them stood up and crossed the aisle, the bus fell silent. Because some men don't raise their voices. They rise when it's time. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The winter afternoon in rural Montana pressed down hard, cold, and gray, the kind of cold that seeped into bone and memory alike. The intercity bus hissed as it opened its doors, releasing a breath of stale heat into the frozen air, and a man stepped up slowly, as if measuring the world before entering it. His name was Daniel Carter, 45 years old, tall and solidly built, shoulders broad, beneath a dark brown leather jacket worn soft by years of use. The jacket creaked faintly as he moved, revealing a red and navy flannel shirt beneath faded at the cuffs. His jeans were silvered with age and wear, creased naturally at the knees, tucked into heavy, cold-resistant leather boots. A gray wool scarf was wrapped once around his neck, not for style, but necessity. Daniel's face was weathered, angular, with a short, disciplined beard, dusted lightly with gray, and eyes that appeared calm, but carried weight eyes that had learned to stay quiet long before his mouth ever did. At his side walked Max, a fully grown German shepherd, approximately 6 years old, powerful and well-conditioned, his black and tan coat thick and clean despite the snow. Max moved with measured control posture, straight head, level eyes, alert, but not reactive, the unmistakable bearing of a dog trained not merely to obey, but to assess. The bus driver, Frank Miller, a heavyset man in his late 50s with thinning hair and tired eyes, glanced briefly at them, nodded without comment, and returned his gaze to the road. Frank had driven this route for nearly 2 decades and had learned that some passengers carried silence like luggage. Daniel guided Max to the rear of the bus, choosing a seat away from others, his movements economical, deliberate, the habit of a man who disliked attention and had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Max sat immediately at Daniel's feet, body close, tail still ears, relaxed but ready, a quiet perimeter drawn without words. For several minutes the only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires against frozen asphalt, until laughter broke through from the front seats. A group of 4 men, all in their early 20s, dressed in work jackets stained with oil and drywall dust, sprawled across the aisle. The apparent leader was Evan Brooks, tall, lean, sharp-jawed, with restless energy and eyes that scanned for weakness as instinctively as breathing. Beside him sat Tyler Grant, broader and slower, his thick arms folded, a smirk fixed beneath patchy stubble. Logan Pierce, wiry and pale with a crooked nose that hinted at past fights, leaned forward eagerly. And Ryan Cole, quieter but watchful eyes, darting between Daniel and Max as if calculating odds. They were local laborers used to noise dominance and being seen, and Daniel's silence irritated them almost immediately. Evan nudged Tyler and nodded toward the back. "That dog even allowed on here," he said loudly, his voice carrying with practiced ease. Tyler chuckled, eyes lingering on Max. "Looks dangerous? Bet it bites." Logan laughed louder than necessary. "Man's hiding behind a dog," he added, twisting in his seat to look directly at Daniel. Daniel did not respond. His gaze remained forward, unfocused, as though listening to something far beyond the bus walls. Inside him, however, the noise registered clearly. He felt the familiar tightening behind the ribs, the instinctive cataloging of exits, distances, timing. He had promised himself this life would be quieter, that he would not be pulled back into confrontation, that Montana would be a place to breathe. His left hand tightened around the edge of his scarf knuckles, whitening briefly before relaxing again. Max sensed the shift instantly. The dog's head lifted, ears angling forward, spine straightening by degrees, eyes now locked on Evan with calm intensity. Evan noticed. "See, even the dog's staring," he said, standing halfway, emboldened by attention. Frank called out from the driver's seat. "Sit down. Let it go." Evan ignored him. He stepped into the aisle, boots thudding against the floor, the bus swaying slightly as it hit a patch of ice. Several passengers, adults in their 30s and 40s, bundled in coats, faces drawn with winter fatigue, looked away, choosing safety in silence. Daniel finally turned his head. His eyes met Evan's, and for the briefest moment something unreadable passed between them. Daniel's expression did not change, but the air seemed to tighten, as if the bus itself had inhaled and held it. Max's ears stood fully erect now, his body coiled but controlled, awaiting direction that did not need to be spoken. Evan scoffed, stepping closer, reaching out a hand toward the dog. At that exact moment, the bus lurched as Frank braked hard tires, screeching bodies jolting forward. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, one deliberate motion placing himself between Evan and Max. His posture was calm, balanced, his eyes no longer distant. They were sharp present and very much awake. No one spoke. The engine idled, snow drifted past the windows, and no one on that bus yet understood what they had just awakened. Snow pressed against the bus windows as dusk settled over Montana, the sky turning the color of old steel while the heater rattled weakly beneath the seats. Daniel Carter remained standing in the aisle, his body steady despite the bus's uneven sway, aware of every breath he took and every sound around him. Years ago, standing like this would have meant imminent violence, but now it meant restraint, a conscious refusal to become the man he once was. His face, lined by time and cold, stayed calm, yet inside him memories stirred, memories he had buried under miles of open land and long seasons of silence. Daniel had not always been a man who avoided attention. Once he had worn a uniform that demanded it. As a Navy SEAL, Daniel had been known among his team for his discipline and quiet reliability. He was never the loudest, never the one who sought recognition, but when decisions had to be made under fire, men had looked to him instinctively. That instinct had been forged during a mission overseas years ago, a mission that went wrong in a way no report could fully explain. An ambush, poor intelligence, a moment of hesitation that cost lives. Daniel survived, but survival came with a weight he had not been trained to carry. When he returned home, medals felt hollow, words from commanding officers sounded distant, and the silence that followed him became unbearable. He left the military quietly, without ceremony, choosing Montana because it was wide enough to swallow a man whole. Max had been with him long before Montana. The German Shepherd was trained as a K-9 partner, nearly 6 years old, now his powerful frame balanced by a controlled temperament. Max's coat was thick and dark, his muzzle marked with faint scars earned in places Daniel rarely allowed himself to remember. On missions, Max had trusted Daniel with absolute certainty, and Daniel had returned that trust without question. When everything else was stripped away, rank purpose comrades Max remained. To Daniel, the dog was not a reminder of violence, but of loyalty, of a time when clarity still existed. On the bus, that loyalty manifested in subtle ways. Max's low growl vibrated just enough to be felt, not heard by most, a warning calibrated with precision. Daniel sensed it immediately. He glanced down briefly, meeting Max's eyes, and gave the slightest nod. The growl did not stop, but it did not escalate either. At the front of the bus, Evan Brooks laughed loudly, misreading the situation entirely. "Hear that?" he said, turning to his friends. "Dog's losing it. Owner too scared to say anything." Tyler Grant leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, amused. Logan Pierce shifted forward, restless, while Ryan Cole watched Daniel more carefully, uncertainty flickering across his narrow face. Daniel registered all of it, the hierarchy, the bravado, the insecurity masked by noise. He had seen this dynamic before in places far more dangerous than a bus. He also knew how quickly it could spiral. A woman seated near the middle aisle, Sarah Whitman, caught his attention. She appeared to be in her early 40s, slim with pale skin and shoulder-length blonde hair tucked into a knitted hat. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, Knuckles' white eyes fixed on the window as if refusing to acknowledge what was happening. Fear, Daniel thought, was often quieter than aggression. Frank Miller cleared his throat again from the driver's seat, his voice strained. "I said sit down. Last warning." Evan ignored him, stepping closer. Daniel felt the familiar tension settle into his muscles, a readiness he had spent years suppressing. He hated how natural it felt, how easy it would be to let instinct take over. He had chosen silence because silence felt safer for everyone. But silence, he was learning, invited misunderstanding. He lowered himself back into his seat, slowly, a deliberate act meant to de-escalate, though it cost him effort. Evan smirked, mistaking the movement for submission. "That's better," he said. Max did not relax. The growl deepened just slightly enough that Evan noticed. "Control your dog?" Evan snapped. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, even carrying authority without volume. "He is under control." The simplicity of the statement unsettled Evan more than shouting would have. For a moment, no one spoke. The bus continued forward, snow blurring the landscape outside. Daniel's thoughts drifted again, unbidden, to the night he had decided to disappear. He had stood alone on a Montana ridge, Max beside him, the wind tearing at his jacket, and realized that silence was the only way he knew how to survive anymore. Not because he was afraid, but because he was tired. Tired of choices that led to funerals. Tired of being the man others depended on in their worst moments. He had promised himself he would never step into that role again. Evan broke the quiet by reaching out abruptly, his hand extending toward Max's head. Daniel's heart rate spiked instantly. Max's body tensed, muscles bunching beneath his coat, teeth barely visible, as the growl sharpened into a clear warning. Daniel's hand tightened around the edge of the seat, his jaw setting as he fought the urge to move. He knew this moment. He had lived versions of it too many times. If Evan touched the dog, everything would change. The bus hit another patch of ice, swaying hard enough that Evan stumbled his hand, stopping inches short of Max. The sudden movement startled several passengers. Sarah gasped softly. Frank cursed under his breath. Daniel rose again, slowly placing himself between Evan and Max, his posture relaxed but unyielding. His eyes met Evan's, steady and unreadable. The silence that followed was heavier than before. No one spoke. Max remained still, his growl fading but not disappearing. Daniel did not threaten. He did not explain. He simply stood there, a quiet barrier, while the past pressed against him, and the present waited to see what he would do next. The snow thickened outside as night closed in flakes, streaking sideways against the bus windows, while the road beneath turned slick and unforgiving. The bus swayed again, and this time Evan Brooks did not regain his balance. His hand came down hard, too hard against Max's shoulder, fingers digging briefly into thick fur in a gesture meant to dominate, not to steady himself. That single touch shattered the fragile restraint holding the moment together. Daniel Carter moved instantly, not with rage, not with noise, but with the precision of a man whose body remembered long before his mind could object. His left hand locked around Evan's wrist, twisting just enough to break leverage, while his right shoulder shifted forward to block the aisle. The movement was fluid, economical, practiced beyond instinct. Evan gasped, surprise flashing across his sharp features before pain could even register. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. Max reacted in perfect synchronization, rising from a sit into a controlled stance chest, forward teeth visible but not snapping, placing his weight precisely where Evan's balance was weakest. The dog did not attack. He didn't need to. The combined pressure forced Evan down onto one knee, his free hand slapping against the floor as the bus lurched to a stop. Tyler Grant surged halfway out of his seat, his broad face twisting with anger, but froze when Daniel turned his head, slightly, eyes locking onto him. There was no threat in Daniel's gaze, only certainty. Tyler felt it immediately, a cold realization that this was not a fight he understood. Logan Pierce hesitated behind him, adrenaline draining into confusion, while Ryan Cole remained seated, pale, his earlier bravado evaporating. Frank Miller slammed the brakes fully, the bus shuddering as it stopped on the shoulder. "Everyone stay seated," he shouted, his voice cracking with stress as he reached for the radio. Passengers cried out, some ducking, others clutching their coats. Sarah Whitman stood abruptly, her breath-shallow eyes wide as she pressed herself against a seat back, torn between fear and disbelief. She had seen violence before, but nothing like this. Nothing so silent, so contained. Daniel released Evan's wrist and stepped back immediately, creating space, de-escalating even as Evan collapsed onto the floor, clutching his arm. Max mirrored the retreat, returning to Daniel's side without command posture, tall but calm eyes, scanning for further threats. Daniel raised both hands slightly, palms open, signaling compliance before anyone could accuse him otherwise. His heart pounded not from fear, but from the old familiarity of action, the part of him he had tried so hard to bury. He hated how alive it made him feel. Evan groaned, rolling onto his back, shock now giving way to humiliation. Tyler knelt beside him, glancing nervously at Daniel. "You didn't have to," Tyler began, but Daniel cut him off with a single look. The words died unfinished. The bus was silent except for the engine idling and Evan's ragged breathing. Frank spoke urgently into the radio, requesting police assistance, his hands shaking slightly as he glanced at Daniel through the rearview mirror. Daniel met his eyes briefly and nodded once, acknowledging the situation without explanation. He could feel the stares burning into his back, feel the shift in how he was being seen. He lowered himself back into his seat, hands resting loosely on his knees, forcing his breathing to slow. Max sat beside him again, close enough that Daniel could feel the warmth of his body through the cold air. The dog's ears remained upright, but his tension eased trust unbroken. Daniel's thoughts raced despite his outward calm. He replayed the moment over and over, analyzing angles, timing choices the way he had been trained to do. He also felt the familiar ache beneath it all, the knowledge that no matter how controlled the response, he had crossed a line he had sworn never to approach again. Sirens pierced the night. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashing across the bus interior, painting the passengers in harsh color. 2 officers arrived quickly. The first officer, Mark Reynolds, appeared to be in his early 40s, tall with a square jaw, close-cropped hair, and the alert posture of someone who had spent years on patrol in unforgiving conditions. His expression was cautious but professional. The second officer, James Holloway, younger and broader, stood slightly behind him, hand resting near his belt, eyes moving constantly. Everyone remained seated, Reynolds ordered calmly as he boarded. His gaze took in the scene immediately. Evan on the floor, Daniel seated with Max at his side, the uneasy passengers. "Who touched the dog?" Reynolds asked, direct and measured. Evan pointed weakly, his voice unsteady, as he tried to regain dignity. "He attacked me." Daniel stood slowly again, hands visible, voice steady. "He reached for my dog. I stopped him. That's all." Reynolds studied Daniel carefully, noting the stance, the controlled movements, the dog's disciplined posture. His tone softened slightly. "Sir, step off the bus with me." Daniel complied without hesitation. Max rose and followed at heel, stopping precisely when Daniel did. The cold hit them immediately, sharp and bracing. Daniel inhaled deeply, grounding himself as the snow fell around them. He had no idea what would come next, only that the quiet life he had chosen had just been interrupted in a way that could not be undone. Behind him, the bus buzzed with whispered conversations, fear slowly giving way to awe. No one on that bus saw Daniel Carter as an ordinary man anymore. Snow fell steadily outside the small-town police station, coating the parking lot in a dull white that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights inside. Daniel Carter sat alone at a metal table, his leather jacket folded neatly over the back of a chair, the room cold in a way that had nothing to do with winter. He rested his forearms on the table, hands relaxed but ready eyes lowered not in shame, but in thought. For years he had learned how to disappear, how to let the world move past him without leaving a mark. Tonight, that distance was no longer available. Max lay calmly at his feet, head resting on his paws, alert, but composed, his breathing slow and steady. The German shepherd looked out of place in the sterile room, yet somehow more grounded than anyone else present. Officer Mark Reynolds stood near the doorway, posture professional, arms crossed loosely, as he observed Daniel with increasing curiosity. Reynolds had seen plenty of violent men, plenty of liars, and plenty of victims pretending to be both. Daniel fit none of those patterns. His movements were too precise, his calm too practiced, his silence too intentional. Officer James Holloway hovered nearby, younger and more tense eyes darting between Daniel and Max, as if unsure which demanded more caution. The door opened quietly, and an older officer stepped in his presence, immediately shifting the atmosphere. Captain Thomas Hale was in his early 60s, tall but slightly stooped, his gray hair trimmed, close face deeply lined by years of service rather than age alone. His eyes were sharp, carrying the weight of someone who had seen enough to know when details mattered. Hale glanced at Daniel once, then at Max, then back again. Something in his expression changed. "Daniel Carter," Hale said slowly, testing the name like a memory. Daniel looked up. Their eyes met, and recognition flickered across Hale's face. Navy Hale continued. "Special warfare. You didn't talk much back then either." The room fell silent. Reynolds straightened, surprise evident, despite his effort to hide it. Daniel exhaled slowly, not denying it. "Yes, sir." Hale nodded once the confirmation settling heavily. "You were listed as medically discharged. Montana address. Didn't expect to see you like this." Daniel didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened briefly before relaxing. He had learned long ago that explaining the past rarely changed it. Hale pulled out a chair and sat across from him, folding his hands. "We've taken statements," Hale said. "Passengers corroborated your account. Evan Brooks and his friends initiated the confrontation. One of them touched your dog." Hale glanced down at Max. "And this dog didn't attack anyone." Daniel's eyes flicked briefly to Max, then back to Hale. "He's trained," Daniel said evenly. "He only responds when necessary." Hale studied Max carefully, noting the dog's posture, the discipline in stillness. K9, Daniel nodded. Former. Hale leaned back slightly, his expression softening into something resembling respect. That explains a lot. Outside the room, voices murmured as Sarah Whitman and other passengers gave their statements. Sarah's voice trembled at first, but grew steadier as she spoke, describing how Daniel had tried to avoid conflict, how the group had escalated it, how Max had never acted without control. When she finished, she glanced through the window at Daniel, meeting his gaze briefly. There was gratitude there, mixed with something else, recognition perhaps, of a man who had chosen restraint even when it cost him. Back inside, Hale rose and turned to Reynolds. Process the group. Disorderly conduct harassment. 1 count of assault. Reynolds nodded, already moving. Holloway followed, relief evident on his face. Hale remained. He looked at Daniel again this time with understanding rather than suspicion. "You didn't run," Hale said quietly. Daniel's lips pressed together. "I've been running for years," he replied. The admission surprised even him. Hale considered this, then nodded. "Silence keeps you alive sometimes," he said. "But it doesn't always keep things right." Daniel absorbed the words, feeling their truth settle in his chest. He thought of Montana, of the open land, and long winters, of how easy it had been to hide there with Max and nothing else. Tonight had stripped that illusion away. He reached down and rested his hand briefly on Max's head. The dog looked up at him, eyes steady, trusting. Daniel realized then that Max had never chosen silence. He had chosen presence. Hale stood. "You're free to go," he said. "Both of you." Daniel rose slowly, retrieving his jacket, slipping it back on with familiar weight. He wrapped his scarf around his neck again, not because he was cold, but because the gesture grounded him. As he walked toward the door with Max at heel, Hale spoke once more. "For what it's worth," he said, "you did the right thing." Daniel paused, then nodded once. Outside, the cold air hit him sharply, snow crunching beneath his boots. The flashing lights were gone now. The bus long departed the town quiet again. But something had shifted. For the first time in years, Daniel did not feel the need to disappear. He understood now that silence had protected him, but it had also isolated him from responsibility, from truth. Max stepped forward beside him, tail low, but relaxed, ready for whatever came next. Daniel followed, eyes forward, no longer avoiding what lay ahead. Winter settled deep over Montana, the kind that slowed time and softened sound snow covering roads, fences, and memories alike. Daniel Carter stood outside his small cabin at dawn. Breath visible in the pale air, the sky stretching wide and colorless above the frozen valley. The land was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. He pulled on his dark brown leather jacket, worn smooth by years of use, wrapped his gray wool scarf around his neck, and stepped forward with purpose he had not felt in a long time. Max moved beside him, steady and silent, his black and tan coat thick against the cold, his presence as constant as the mountains themselves. Life had not changed overnight, but something within Daniel had shifted, settling into place after years of resistance. He still lived alone, still preferred mornings before the world stirred, but he no longer hid from it. Word traveled quickly in small towns, and stories tended to outgrow the truth. People spoke quietly about the man on the bus, about the dog that never lost control, about the way things ended without chaos. Daniel did not correct them. He simply showed up when needed. He began volunteering at a local search and rescue training ground on the outskirts of town, a wind-swept stretch of forest where volunteers practiced navigating blizzards and uneven terrain. The coordinator, Michael Turner, a man in his early 50s with a broad frame, thick beard, and practical demeanor shaped by years of emergency response work, watched Daniel carefully at first. Michael was not suspicious, just cautious. He had learned that men who spoke little often carried more than they shared. Daniel never mentioned his past. He didn't need to. His knowledge revealed itself through action, how he read terrain, how he corrected handlers with calm clarity, how Max demonstrated controlled tracking without aggression. Max moved through snowdrifts with precision nose-low body aligned, responding to subtle hand signals rather than commands. Other dogs followed his lead instinctively. Daniel worked patiently with them, his voice low, never raised, understanding that trust could not be forced. Veterans began to find him too. Some recognized the signs in his posture, the way his eyes scanned rooms, the silence that masked old wounds. One of them, Tom Alvarez, a former infantryman in his late 40s with close-cropped dark hair and a permanent stiffness in his left leg, approached Daniel one afternoon. Tom's face was lined, his skin weathered his humor, dry but edged with fatigue. He didn't ask about the bus. He didn't ask about the military. He simply stood beside Daniel watching Max work and said, "It helps, doesn't it?" Daniel nodded once. That was enough. They spoke little after that, but they worked together, often helping train dogs, sharing quiet coffee breaks, understanding each other without explanation. Even Sarah Whitman crossed Daniel's path again. She visited the training site one morning, bundled against the cold, her blonde hair tucked under a knit cap, her movements cautious but deliberate. She thanked him awkwardly, her voice steady now, eyes clearer than before. "You didn't have to step in," she said. Daniel looked past her toward the tree line. "Someone had to," he replied. She smiled faintly and left him to his work lighter than when she arrived. Daniel noticed that Max watched her go, then returned his focus to the task at hand, loyal as ever. At night, Daniel returned to his cabin, the fire crackling softly, the walls smelling of wood and smoke. He sat with Max at his feet, sometimes thinking of the men he had lost, sometimes not thinking at all. He no longer pushed the memories away. He let them exist without control, without judgment. He understood now that silence had been a shield, but also a barrier. Strength, he realized, wasn't about dominance or recognition. It was about presence, being there when it mattered, standing firm without needing applause. On a quiet morning after a heavy snowfall, Daniel and Max walked a narrow road leading away from town. Snow blanketed everything, muting the world into stillness. Daniel's boots left deep prints behind him, Max's tracks running parallel. Daniel adjusted his scarf, feeling the familiar weight of his jacket, the cold biting at his cheeks. He stopped briefly, looking out over the valley, and felt something close to peace. Max stood beside him, alert but relaxed, tail low, ears, steady, the perfect balance of readiness and calm. They continued forward together, two figures moving through winter, without urgency, without fear. Daniel did not know what the future held. He didn't need to. He knew only that when the moment came, when someone crossed a line, when the quiet was threatened, he would not look away. He would stand, not loudly, not for praise, but because it was right. And beside him always would be Max, the silent guardian who never asked for more than trust. The road stretched ahead, white and open, and they walked into it together. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not loud. They arrive quietly through restraint, compassion, and the courage to stand when it truly matters. Daniel's journey reminds us that God does not always choose the strongest voice in the room, but often the strongest heart. In moments of darkness, when injustice feels overwhelming, God places guardians among us, ordinary people carrying extraordinary grace, guided by faith even when they no longer realize it themselves. In our daily lives, we may never face a bus full of danger, but we all face moments where silence feels safer than doing what is right. This story invites us to trust that when we act with humility, discipline, and love, God works through us in ways we may never see. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more stories of faith and courage, and may God bless and protect every one of you watching.